All right, so let's pick up where we left off with Herodotus. If you don't remember, Herodotus was a philosopher and a historian um, back in 500 BC. Okay, he was the first historian. He was like the world's first journalist, where he would document both sides of the story. You know, not just what his opinion or his views were, but the views of his enemy and their opinions. You get it? So he was the first one to bring together both sides, just so he could document the true recesses of history of what actually happened. So he starts with, in his book of histories, he starts with a story about an Egyptian king, King Psammetichus. Now, this is a picture of Akhenaten, by the way. I just threw that up there. We'll talk about him later. But anyway, so Psammetichus, the Egyptians were very proud of the fact that they were the most ancient of races. So even the ancient Egyptians were proud of being ancient Egyptians. You get it? So even back then, they were like, oh yeah, we're the oldest race. Well, there was an issue. There was a debate about between them and another race about who was actually the most ancient of races. So the king concocted a test to prove who was the eldest race, and he instructed a herdsman to take these two children, these newborn children, and take them to the middle of nowhere and raise them without ever speaking a word to them. He could never talk to them, and they could never hear any language. And after in a couple years, and he's like, when they do talk, come back and tell me what they say. 3 years go by, and one day the herdsman shows up. He's taking care of them, brings them some food, and when he shows up, they say, "Bekos, Bekos," and he's like, "Oh, that's not just childish jibber jabber. They're actually saying a word." So he took the kids to see the king, and they spoke for him. They said Bekos, and the king didn't know. He turned to his priest and asked him, what did Bekos mean? What was that? And his priest said, Bekos means bread in the language of the Phrygians. And so King Psammetichus had to yield their position and admit that although the Egyptians were the most powerful of the ancient races, they were not the most ancient race. That title is held by the Phrygians. So, and I think it's interesting that the way he figured it out by raising a kid never to speak, and so the language that they would just naturally come up with on their own, the words they would come up with themselves, was the language of the Phrygians, the first language. Now, what's cool about the Phrygians is a lot of people don't really know who they are or what they stand for. There's like so many different races that were around at that time with them that they don't really stand out. There's not a lot of evidence on them, but basically the Phrygians were a race of giants. Okay, they come from modern day Turkey. All right, so and I'm saying that they're a race of giants in the same sense as like the Philistines and the Hittites were a race of giants. Biblical records state that they were giants. So I know a lot of people don't like to go off stuff that's said in the Bible. I do for historical references. I'm completely not religious. But for historical references, I feel that the stuff is important to take into account what people said back then. So, as you see with David and Goliath, Goliath was the most fierce warrior of the Philistine army. But he wasn't the only giant. In fact, he had 5 brothers. All right. So like there were just giants around. That's just what they, even in Genesis, it says that, there were giants in the earth in those days, and after that, after the flood. Okay, so before the flood, it was all giants. Then after the flood, there was some giants, and we still have like remnants of these giants left over. Like there's still people who are basically giants, and I think that that was like they're that's why they were like worshipped as gods, or they would be kings and they would pass down kingship and stuff because of their great size and everything. But basically every race around the world had giants mixed in with their races. You got it, like the Egyptians, the Phrygians, the Hittites, and the Philistines. Everywhere there was some giant somewhere. When it comes to the biblical giants and stuff, you can't have a story without Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the first story ever written. It's the first epic tale, epic poem ever recorded by man that we know about anyway. And the story of Gilgamesh is Gilgamesh was a king, and he was a giant. He was this smooth talking badass warrior who thought he was the shit and basically was the shit. Well, he met his brother, who was a wild man who lived in nature with the animals, and was basically covered in hair, and was this powerful warrior as well. And when Gilgamesh found out about him, he was like, oh, this dude's supposed to be a badass. Well, fuck that. I'm gonna go kick his fucking ass. And because he has to be the baddest motherfucker around. This is basically a story, okay? So he goes and meets his brother, and they don't know they're brothers or anything. They just decide that in the end that they are brothers or whatever. And they go and they fight. They fucking battle. Now Gilgamesh at this time had kicked everybody's ass like it wasn't shit. All right, he fucking rocked fools, and no one could challenge him. And then he goes and fights this wild man, and all of a sudden, he's met someone who has his strength and his power, and he had never battled someone like that before. And because of that, he was getting beaten by this guy. He became like, envious of him. He was like, wow. He was like kind of starstruck by him. He's like, this dude's bad as fuck, man. He was super impressed with him. And he was like, I can't beat your strength, although our strengths are the same. So we like balance each other out, none of us can win or whatever. But then Gilgamesh was like, nah, fuck that. I'm a little bit smarter than you. You're just a fucking crazy ass wild man. So what he did is he went and got a fucking hoe. He went and got some hoochie mama. And he was like, hey, go over there and fuck that hairy dude. And she was like, yeah, you got it, whatever, And she went over there and they fucking banged. And then that made his brother not be part of nature anymore. All right. This is like the ghetto-ized version of it, but I'm telling you, that's the Epic of Gilgamesh, you guys. It was crazy. And but it's like there's interesting things. It's the details that are important. Like one of the things is that him and his brother go to fight these giants and these monsters. Okay, and where does he go to fight these giants and these monsters? He goes to the land of the cedars. Well, do you guys know where the land of the cedars would be? Lebanon. Lebanon is the land of the cedars, cedar cheese, giant cedar cheese. And in Lebanon is a temple in a place called Baalbek. And it is the largest temple ever built by humans. The stones there are the largest stones ever moved by man. They have 3 stones there called the Trilithon stones. They are the largest stones in history that have ever been moved. They are humongous, weighing upwards of 1,200 tons. Okay? All right, so this is Lebanon. This is the stone of the south, the stone of the pregnant woman. And it was the largest stone ever meant to be used for construction. Although they say, of course, as you can see, it wasn't actually used. And the reason why they say it, it was the largest or whatever, they say it was actually too big to have been moved or transported. That they got overzealous and they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna move something this huge, and they're like, no, they couldn't do it. Like it was too heavy. They were saying that the gravity alone would break it or whatever. And they tried to attribute the building of like the Temple of Jupiter and Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek. They try to attribute it to the Romans because no civilization before them should have been capable of building, such a monumental structure. And when the Romans found it, it was basically just the platform. And people in ancient astronaut theory like to claim that the platform was a launching pad for a rocket ship. It's fucking just so stupid. It's like, you could put the fucking rocket on the ground. I doubt it's going to fucking, destroy the Earth, So if the ground can't support it, I mean, what the fuck? I mean, give me a break, it would have been fine. They wouldn't have had to have huge stones. They could have fucking buried some stones and made it flat with the Earth and underground, and it would have been fine. It would have been like a total foundation for it. It would have broke or anything. It would have been totally fine. But it's not that. It's not an ancient spaceport, okay? That's fucking stupid. Now, you could see right here, this is what the Romans did to it. When they wanted to use the blocks for construction, they had to take the big blocks and cut them into little pieces because they could not move the big pieces. So that's, Roman technology came down to they could lift about 5 tons, and all the academics agree with that. That's the most that they could lift. So, anything more than that, their cranes and their pulleys wouldn't work. I mean, look at the size of these are, gigantic. We're talking thousands of tons, and when they built the Temple of Jupiter or whatever, they say that they built the Temple of Jupiter, but we don't actually know because there's no record of them actually building it. Now, the Romans kept records of everything from across the, all of the planet that they've built stuff. Wherever they had settlements, wherever they went and the army took over, they had, receipts and shit from the kings and stuff where they were getting paid their tributes and everything like that. So everything was recorded. They were really good at documenting what they owned and what was theirs, what was Roman stuff. And there is no payments, there is no anything about actually building the Temple of Jupiter. It was just that as a religious place, they say that it's ours, that they took it over, basically. Look at this. I mean, if this place wasn't a place for giants, I don't know what is. I mean, fucking look at that. How do you really need a doorway that fucking big? I mean, look at the size of the people. I mean, who needs a doorway that's fucking 45 feet tall? I mean, that's fucking ridiculous, So, that's another thing that leads me to believe that this most likely was built by a giant species, a pre-diluvian people built this. And another thing that's interesting, in the tape, the Ancient Aliens Debunked, Chris White, that fundamentalist fucking psycho Christian, he goes and says that this, they know exactly how the stones at Baalbek were moved and lifted into place and everything. And he shows these drawings of them like building like these like kind of exoskeleton thing around them and like lifting it up and having all these pulleys with men and like oxen or whatever, like turning these cranks and like moving this giant piece of stone. And it was a theory that was disproven a long time ago, but one of the things that he couldn't have known, even though a lot of ancient astronaut theorists said he's wrong, he was like, no, this is what the evidence shows. They couldn't even lift that big stone, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out he was fucking wrong. Now, I think he should go back and say, okay, yeah, I was wrong, and make another video about it, because we know now he didn't know this when he made the video. But we know this now, that not only that stone is not the biggest stone. And we also know that there was bigger stones that were moved here at Baalbek. And we know this because underneath the stone of the south are the other stones that once they dug down and cleared it all out, they realized there's a bunch more right underneath. You see the size of the stone? The stone that we're looking at right now on the bottom is actually bigger than this stone on top. And see how it's tilted to the side like that? Everyone thought that it was still attached to the bedrock. It's not actually attached to it. It was on top of it. And see how it's like cut at these angles. So if you dig down, which they have, you dig down, you see this is its own separate piece. And there's another one on, there's 3 of them right here. But there's actually more of them as you work your way down. And they found it out with ground penetrating radar. And so they know that these have been moved because they are not in the position that they should be, that they're totally cut loose from the thing. If they had cranes that could lift them, they would just lift right up. And now the weight and the gravity alone makes it appear like it is stuck together, but it's not. It's separate. They could move it, and obviously because this one there are missing ones, as you can tell, they obviously moved them. So they were wrong about the size of that being the biggest stone, and it was too big to move because there were even bigger stones that were moved. It's just that's the fact. I think he should go back and change that shit because he was fucking wrong again. Here we're looking at the King's List, and what's interesting about like the King's List and everything is back in the day, for some reason, all the antediluvian people lived incredibly long lives. And now the Bible records it as like from Adam and Eve. Adam was 930 years old, and from that time, people lived, like close to 1,000 years. And before the deluge, people lived thousands and thousands of years. But it's not just the Bible that recorded that. The Sumerian King's List also recorded that. So all their kings lived, 34,000 years, 45,000 years, 28,000 years. It's like the craziest, ranges of age. But they're not the only ones also. The Egyptian King List also states that, after the deluge, their kings lived like 900 years or 1,000 years until it got down to, whatever, 100 years, 80 years, 40 years, 9 years, whatever. And before the deluge, all the kings lived for 5,000 years, 20,000 years, 45,000 years. I mean, like crazy lengths of time. And this is something that's repeated throughout the world. I mean, everybody has a flood myth. There's no civilization that doesn't have a flood myth. I mean, you gotta question that. And when it comes to like looking for actual physical evidence, there are pieces out there that I find very fascinating and interesting. I think that should be included when teaching, the archaeological record, like these giant footprints that you find in stone. This is another thing, a phenomenon that we find all around the world. If it was just one off carved one, then okay, I could say, yeah, it's an anomaly or whatever. It's just a piece of art. Someone carved it out. But we find these giant footprints all over the world, and we find them in places where people like didn't even like try to build megalithic structures. And we find them in like sediment and in rock or whatever, like that it shouldn't fucking be there. The only reason it's there is, like they're like, did someone come out into the middle of the fucking jungle and, carve this footprint? There wasn't even a civilization around that should have been able to do that. Like, for instance, now this footprint is from India. I believe that it is a carved one, though. Just from the style of it, just the way it looks. It does look like a carved one. But when you get to ones like this is from Patagonia, and like in Uruguay and Argentina and Paraguay, that like they actually have a ton of these legends of giants. Like everything was super fucking huge out there. All their dinosaurs, all their stuff was like the largest dinosaur in the world. The Argentinosaurus is found out there. I'll show you some bones from that thing too. It's just fucking crazy. This too is from Patagonia, and they have their legends about giants fucking go back from the beginning of time. You know, these are the footprints of Lord Hominin. All right. And he was a god who lived, and whenever they find a footprint, they say, oh, you know, the Lord, you know, stepped here or whatever. But I'm like, these feet print are in, you know, they're not into cut or hewn stone. They're into natural stone. Look at the lichen patches within the toes, okay? That means that, I mean, lichen patches take thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years to form. So, since you can see the lichen patches running through the curve in it or whatever, it had to be there first. It had to be, the toe print had to be first, and then the lichen patches went over top of it. You get it? If it was just carved out, then there shouldn't be any the lichen patches on it. It should be clean, because unless it was carved out tens of thousands of years ago, you know. So it doesn't, you know, there again, it still doesn't make sense. Look at some of these, like, these mummy feet and shit. Look at the size of those fucking things, man. I mean, that shit's crazy. I wonder where they found that stuff at, dude. Look, it's still got flesh on it. That's fucking nasty. Ugh. God damn. I forget where this is from, though. It's another interesting one, and like the date on the ages of some of these feet print into stone are so old. Some of them, they date them at like millions of years old. And you know, when I see stuff like that, I'm like, there's got to be an issue with the dating, you know. And yes, that is a dinosaur footprint on top of a human footprint. I'm like, you know, we got to do something about the standard, you know, radiocarbon dating. I mean, it's just, I don't think it holds up. This is another one of Lord Hominin from Patagonia. I mean, they have giants all over out there. Like in South America, man, they're like full of fucking giants. I mean, look at the size of that. Who just goes and carves that in the middle of the fucking jungle? You know? It doesn't make any sense. Once again, if you look close, you can see the form of lichen patches right by the toes, and some of the orange ones. Now look at these. Now these are actual instruments from giants. Okay, these axes, you think they are just models, you know, like they're just like a sculpture. No, these were real, and the handles have been replaced so they stand upright. But they found them. The wood was almost rotted away, but these axe heads are used, and they can see that they've been used. They can see all the residue, the tree resin and stuff that's on them. Look at the size of this axe head. Okay, 120-pound axe head. Who the fuck is swinging that around? For real. I mean, even our strongest guy, is he gonna fucking swing that around? Fuck no. I mean, that does. Look at the size of that. That's fucking ridiculous. But it's real. There's the evidence right there. You know, and they say, oh, so should we account this, you know, as, you know, part of the archaeological record? Fuck no. Look at these hand axes. Now, you know what, like, the Clovis people and their stone hand axes look like. So, I mean, look at these. It's the same thing, only 50 times bigger. I mean, who the fuck is lifting these? You know? I mean, it has the exact same shape as a Clovis spearhead or axe head, except it's, you know, 20 times bigger. Look at these pots right here. These pots are almost 2 tons. Who the fuck is making a pot that's fucking 2 tons? And, you know, like, oh yeah, we just need a big jug right there where we'll never move it ever again. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's fucking crazy. Who needs a pot that fucking big? I don't know if these are stone or if they're terracotta or what. This one's terracotta, and the same community in Turkey was using this stone jug to make wine out of for 2,000 years. And when they ask them, you know, where did you get it from? They said it was left over from a giant. So they're like, yeah, no, it was a giant's, and we just kind of kept using it. That's what they say. Now this place is fucking cool. This kind of ties everything together. Ayan Duyu is a temple in Turkey. Again, Turkey. And these people were like obsessed with this. They had a fascination with like this lion culture. So they had lions on everything. And as you can see, one of the reasons why this place looks different is because all the stone is black. That's because it's made from basalt and diorite, like the hardest stones on earth. I mean, diorite's harder than granite, you know? I think it's second only to diamond. And this is what their entire thing was made out of. You know, but people don't talk about this. But I think if you connect all the dots, it has a lot to do with it. Now, once again, like I said, this is like a lion culture. They put lions on everything. Well, if you look back at the pictures from Baalbek, you'll see lions' heads everywhere. And it looks like there's some kind of there's some kind of connection there with these, you know, these people who had this obsession with lions. And now think about this. Now, like, you know, Baalbek was 9,000 years old and had all this lion motif. And, here's Father Karepsky with, these are belts. That's an actual belt. So the guy who Eric Von Daniken claimed he found a metal library or whatever, even though Father Karepsky's like, just people gave them to me or made them or whatever, you know, he doesn't agree with Eric. But look at the size of these belts. Is that fucking crazy? Look at the size of that guitar. Now, that's not one that you could just play as a stand-up, because look how wide the neck is. You couldn't get your fucking hand around it. You know, so it doesn't make sense unless it's being played by someone who's fucking really big, you know? Now, getting back to the lion motif, you know, the incredibly old age of the Phrygians, who would have been these lion people, like with the Hittites and stuff. And then you see the lion motifs at Baalbek and places that are 9,000 years old. And now think about the Sphinx. Now the Sphinx, they date at close to 12,500 years old now. Again, you know, incredibly old. And they are pretty sure that there was another head on top of it. And most people say they think it was a lion's head, and they carved it into a pharaoh's head thousands of years later. And we know that the pharaoh who uncovered the Sphinx, he because there's a stela in between the Sphinx's paws that reads that the king fell asleep by the Sphinx, and he had a dream, and the Sphinx told him that, and he wasn't a pharaoh at the time. The Sphinx told him if he uncovers his body, that the Sphinx would make him pharaoh. And so the king went and uncovered his body and dug all the sand around, and they were like, oh yeah, they made him pharaoh, you know. But that right there proves that, because at the time the Sphinx was buried up to its head again, and when we rediscovered it today, it's buried up to its head. We had to dig it all out. So it filled up and got covered with the blowing sand to the top of its head twice. You know? I mean, that's how fucking old it is. And when you see the size of the head compared to the body, it looks like a little fucking peanut head. It's not even close. And obviously, they know how to, draw stuff in proportion. And yet, that's not even close. That doesn't even look like it should be there. It looks completely out of place on top of it. Now, another interesting fact that I like to point out real quick is that the stela right here, not only does it tell about the dream, but it also tells about how this is the guardian sphinx of the West. Okay? And it talks about the guardian sphinx of the East. It says there are two sphinxes. So I'm saying, I think under the sand on the opposite side somewhere, you should find another sphinx that protects the that's there to fucking protect the temple that was there. And I think they need to go and dig under there and hit it with ground penetrating radar, because on this side, which is closer to the Nile, and everything got uncovered over there, like they removed all the sand, but behind the pyramid and everything, it's not. It's just tons of sand everywhere. They haven't excavated any of that shit. How much you want to bet there's another fucking sphinx over there? I mean, the stela says there is. So I think they need to fucking look and actually take it seriously. Now, another thing you have to discuss when talking about advanced human timelines, like us going back to, way before the Sumerians and stuff. You can't discuss that without bringing up the Piri Reis map. Now, Piri Reis was a sailor, navigator, and cartographer, and this is his map. Now, what's interesting about the map is it shows the outline, the coastline of South America and Antarctica, Queen's Maud Land, and you can see under. It shows the actual coastline as it looked underneath the ice. And how did he, come about this map? Did he go and he mapped it? No. All right. He put this map together from a bunch of older, ancient source maps. Okay. And the thing that's really interesting about Piri Reis is he was a Turkish admiral in the Turkish Navy, and he made this map in 1500, 300 years before Antarctica was discovered. But he said, hey, I put this map together from all these source maps. It actually even says it on the map. But he's a Turkish, so the source maps that he got were from Turkey. See where I'm going with all this? I'm going to just lay it all out. I believe they are wrong about the Sumerians being the first civilization. Okay? I believe that the first civilization comes from Turkey 13,000 years ago. So 7,000 years before the Sumerians existed, the civilization there was a highly advanced civilization, so to speak. Okay? But that they were, in fact, the most ancient, the first race came from Turkey. That Turkey is the cradle of civilization and not Mesopotamia. All right, that's all the evidence leads me to that destination, as opposed. And one of the best piece of evidence is Göbekli Tepe. All right, now the oldest megalithic ruins on Earth, the oldest temple on Earth, is Göbekli Tepe, and it has giant monolithic stones weighing between 20 and 40 tons. They're upright pillars, these T-shaped pillars, and they're actually buried after they were created. But they date Göbekli Tepe at 13,000 years old. Even the academics agree with this age. All right, and with that being said, would it make more sense with all this other evidence included that Turkey is in fact the cradle of civilization and not Iraq? Now, this is a royal tomb, royal temple on Mount Nemrut, also in Turkey, and it's cool because they all have cone heads for some reason. Like all the motifs you see of them have cone heads. They also have these giant lion edifices and eagle men style edifices. So when you would see the birdmen of every other place and or sphinxes or everything, it seems that these guys were the first to create all that stuff. I mean, it makes sense to me that they are the first civilization coming, being twice as old as the Sumerians. I mean, and they try to date a lot of the stuff. They say, oh no, this is pretty new, even though they have no actual way to date it. They can't date the actual pieces of stone or anything. They have to just date any kind of living material, any kind of plant life or something like that, that's that they can use radiocarbon dating on. Other than that, they can't date the stone. They don't have no idea when the hell it's from. It'd be millions of years old if they're trying to date the stone. So it's they don't know. They just assume. But when I look at all the evidence, I say that they are the cradle of civilization. That is where the first people came from. Now, you guys are probably wondering, what does any of this have to do with ancient aliens? I'll tell you, because even the Phrygians and the people who built Göbekli Tepe and all these people, even they had gods. And the interesting thing is that this is what their gods looked like.